What's up, everybody? I'm John Miller, and this is How the Hell Did We Get Here? A U.S. history podcast. In the last episode, I discussed westward expansion and the circumstances of Native Americans, how the victory of the United States in the American Revolution affected Native Americans and was largely very bad for them because it meant that westward expansion ramped up and a lot of white folks wanted land that Native Americans had been on for centuries. There was inevitable conflict over this, and I got into the details of that. I talked about how that progressed, how states and the federal government dealt with Native Americans, and the ways in which the Washington administration attempted to walk a kind of middle ground between buying Native American land and taking Native American land, and did have at least aspirations of assimilating Native Americans into white American society. Of course, it didn't really work, and ultimately there was a lot of violent conflict that ended up with Native Americans being forced off of their land by the end of the Washington administration. 2 episodes ago, I talked about the beginnings of the federal government under the new Constitution. I discussed the ways in which the government had to kind of figure itself out because the Constitution, as I have said many times, is not very long, not very specific, and there were a lot of ways in which the government was going to have to work on a day-to-day basis and figure things out on the fly. Like the executive branch and the legislative branches, Congress and the presidency, would have to interact with each other and just figure out how that was going to work, because it's not really spelled out in the Constitution when they would meet, how they would communicate with each other, etc., etc. Congress built up the executive branch by creating several executive departments, the Department of the Treasury, the Department of State, and so forth. It created the lower portions of the judiciary. The Supreme Court is the only thing that's really mentioned in the Constitution. Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1789, which created the structure for the lower courts, the appellate courts and the district courts. And a lot of that stuff had to be done in the early days, mostly by the House of Representatives. So I talked about that. And then finally, for the purposes of the discussion today, I talked about Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, his plans for the United States finances, how he planned to pay off the debt, and all of the machinations of that. The creation of the Bank of the U.S. and so forth. And the reason I mention that stuff now is that what Hamilton did with the Treasury Department is very much responsible for what I'm going to talk about today, the creation of the United States' first political parties. It was a lot of Hamilton's policies and the fact that many who were sympathetic to him and in the Washington administration and in Congress at this time saw Hamilton's approach as the best way to do things, and the fact that there were a lot of people in Congress, in the states, and Thomas Jefferson, who was in the Washington administration, who very much did not like what Hamilton was doing, disagreed with it for a number of reasons, and that fundamental disagreement over how the government was going to operate and how to interpret the Constitution became the basis for the ideological split between these two parties, the Federalist Party and the Democratic-Republican Party, or the Republican Party for short. Not to be confused with today's modern Republican Party, which didn't start until the 1850s, really. So I'm going to get into that today, but before I do, I'd like to remind you all to please like and subscribe if you have not already done so. It is very helpful to the channel, helps other people find it, gets more attention on it, and allows me to keep doing this thing. Please spread the word to any family or friends who you think might be into it. I would greatly appreciate it. If you like what you're seeing and hearing so far, spread the word, like and subscribe. Thanks very much. I really appreciate it. I'm going to start, as I always do, by introducing the materials that I use to construct this episode, as well as a question for you all to think about as I'm going through this information. So let me start with the materials. They haven't changed from the last couple of episodes. It's again the American Pageant, which is a very common AP US history textbook. There's also Give Me Liberty, another common AP US history textbook. There is John Adams, the biography by David McCullough. There is The Art of Power which is the biography of Thomas Jefferson by John Meacham, and there is Empire of Liberty, which is the book in the Oxford History of the United States series that covers this period, roughly 1785 to 1815, that I'll be referencing. The question that I think it would be good for y'all to think about as I'm going through and doing this is, what led to the formation of the first political parties by the end of Washington's presidency, and how did this change the way that the United States government and voting public experienced American democracy? I'll say that one more time. What led to the formation of the first political parties by the end of Washington's presidency, and how did this change the way that the United States government and voting public experienced American democracy? Okay, so just to remind everybody of the basics, Hamilton's program was all about how to repay the national debt at par, because Hamilton, thought it was very important to establish the United States' credit worthiness to the rest of the world. He saw the future of the United States in commerce. He thought the United States should try as much as it could to emulate Great Britain in terms of its economy, because Great Britain had a flourishing economy that was built around trade and was starting to be built around manufacturing. Hamilton didn't see manufacturing as quite as big a piece of the future of the American economy as it has sometimes been depicted by historians or whatever. He wrote about it and he was interested in industry, in manufacturing, but he didn't quite focus as much on it. He was very much concerned with trying to make sure that merchants, that bankers, that businessmen could thrive. He did that by making sure that the United States would pay off all of its debts, that it would be easy for creditors to borrow money, that businessmen could find capital relatively easily, and that people would be willing to buy American bonds in the future. He saw that as very important. On top of that, there was a political element to what he was doing that he thought was very important. He thought that the government's willingness, the federal government's willingness to pay off not only its debt, but also all of the state debts, would give a lot of folks who maybe were a little skeptical of the federal government more of a stake in its success. Because if the federal government were to take on all of these state debts, that would give the states a sort of rooting interest in the success of the federal government. And Hamilton's biggest concern, like Washington, like John Adams, like a number of other what we would eventually call Federalists of that political party, not just people who wanted the Constitution ratified, because originally they were called Federalists, and those who didn't want the Constitution ratified were the anti-Federalists. But that changes a little bit once the Constitution's ratified. The Federalists, like John Adams, like George Washington, like Alexander Hamilton, were most concerned with the survival of the American government and the continued union of the United States. That was very tenuous in their minds. It was something that could fall apart at any time. They thought it was more important than anything to have a solid foundation for the American Union and to keep all of the states together, to keep everybody rowing in the same direction as much as possible, because it was a big, complicated country even back then. And they sensed that it was going to be really difficult to develop a sense of national unity that would supersede people thinking of themselves as Virginians, as North Carolinians, as New Yorkers, as New Hampshireites first and foremost, and not as Americans. So by creating this financial program that would pay off all these national debts, it would give people a little bit more of an incentive to root for the success of the United States under the Constitution. And that was very important in Hamilton's mind, in addition to establishing the sound financial footing and creditworthiness of the United States. However, a lot of people were very nervous about what Hamilton was doing. They were nervous about all the power that the Treasury Department in particular was accruing. They were nervous about the federal government taking on these debts. They saw it as almost a bribe. And there were some people who were really suspicious about the federal government maybe at some point even eliminating the existence of states. And that this was a mechanism to accomplish that, this being the paying off of all of these state debts and putting it under the Treasury Department and giving the Treasury Department effectively the ability to create and control American currency and finance all over the country. That made a lot of folks who were already nervous about the new national government even more nervous about it. There's also, of course, the strict constructionists, the folks who said that the federal government should be limited to doing only what is explicitly stated in the Constitution. And that argument, they lost with the Bank of the United States. It was close. Remember, I said that Washington had Madison draft a veto message. Washington, was really on the fence about whether or not to sign the Bank of the U.S. bill into law. But ultimately he did, because Hamilton convinced him that it was the right thing to do, that because of the necessary and proper clause coupled with the commerce clause of the Constitution, it was totally constitutional, in Hamilton's view, to have a Bank of the United States to execute the commerce power that is explicitly stated in the Constitution. And that provided the foundation for many, many, many expansions of federal government power in the decades and centuries afterward. The loose constructionists, the guys who are like, the federal government should be able to do anything not explicitly forbidden by the Constitution, the ones who are much more comfortable with the power of the national government, they very clearly won the argument over the Bank of the United States, and that carried over, that argument, their success in that argument carried over for generations afterward, because there's a lot of things that approach, that view of the Constitution justified in the years afterward. But it wasn't just strict constructionists who were concerned about what Hamilton was doing, or those concerned about states' rights, or those concerned about the financial powers of the country becoming a kind of aristocracy. There were also farmers, mostly out west around the Appalachian Mountains, who were furious about one of Hamilton's devices for paying off the national debt. It was mostly a combination of tariffs, which were largely perceived as, in those days, a way of taking in revenue. Not as much about protecting industry, although there's a little of that in the late 18th century. Mostly it was about taking in revenue because they didn't have things like income tax back then. It was a combination of tariffs and excise taxes. There's some other things in there too, but those are the two main things. And the excise taxes are the ones that really exercised a lot of people, really pissed off a lot of people. In this case, there's an excise tax on whiskey that becomes the bane of the Hamiltonian program. They really come to despise the excise tax on whiskey in particular. This issue over the excise tax becomes one of the foundational points for the division of the American voting public into political parties and of political leaders into political parties. Hamilton thought the excise tax revenue was absolutely necessary to pay off the debts that the United States had incurred and that the federal government had taken on from the states. The authority to implement an excise tax was very clear in the Constitution, but a lot of Americans really resented it, especially those who were distant from the federal government, who were more rural, and who had less interaction and contact with this government that they saw as almost kind of foreign, in the same way that colonists had thought of the British government. This new national government, because it was new and because it was so distant from a lot of these folks who were having to pay this excise tax, it wasn't easy for those folks who were paying this excise tax and aren't happy about it to feel as though it was doing them any good or that it was in the national interest or anything like that. There had been sort of a stern warning from anti-federalists, those opposed to the ratification of the Constitution, about excise taxes as the ratification process was going forward. In actuality, the anti-federalists were nervous about giving the federal government the power to tax, period, but they kind of focused on excise taxes because that was a subject familiar to a lot of just average people, having to pay something like an excise tax that directly cost them money. Something like a tariff, that's more indirect. It's on imported goods, most of which are luxury goods, and that doesn't touch a lot of common people, a lot of average people, the way that an excise tax had and would under this program. The Anti-Federalists who were sort of ringing the alarm bells about this said that giving the federal government the power to tax would result in like marauding gangs of excise tax men. There would even be like armed troops who would come along with this. Collection of these taxes would be accompanied by military enforcement. It was a way of kind of scaring people about the power of the new federal government, but it's not entirely illegitimate either, this depiction, because at the end of the day, if you don't pay your taxes, there's got to be some kind of enforcement, and it's not out of the question that the military might get involved there. This whole episode eventually did end with something like that. I'll get there in a moment. Even after the Constitution's ratified, excise taxes are so hated that Congress rejected Hamilton's initial bill in 1790 that included an excise tax, but eventually the Congress did pass the excise tax in 1791, in no small part because a bunch of physicians, doctors, had come forward and said, you know what, wouldn't be such a bad thing if we put a tax on whiskey and people were drinking a little bit less. That provided the little extra nudge necessary to make the excise tax a little more palatable. Of course, passing the excise tax did not improve the view that most people in the West held of the federal government after it went into effect. Some Westerners were already pretty pissed off at the federal government for failing to protect them better from Native Americans. That's something I discussed a lot in the last show, that the federal government was trying to kind of walk this line between working things out peacefully with the Native Americans and not starting a whole big war by defending violently Western settlers from Native Americans. And a lot of the Western settlers, from their point of view, saw it as the federal government not doing its job to protect them. That the most fundamental thing it was supposed to do was guarantee their safety. Even though a lot of these folks were squatters and they had not paid any fees to acquire the land that they were on, and even though they had disregarded any kind of treaties that Native Americans may have signed with the states or with the federal government, they still saw it as a failure of the federal government to protect them. So Westerners were already pissed off at the federal government for not protecting them, in their view, from Native Americans, and conspiracy theories started flying around everywhere. Conspiracy theories, it turns out, are as American as apple pie, because they go back about as far as the country does. They even predate the United States as an independent country. I've talked about that before. And at this time, the conspiracy theory was that Anti-Federalists said the excise tax collection and the power it was giving to the national government and the power it was giving to the Department of Treasury was just a pretext for eliminating the states altogether. I mentioned that a few moments ago. There were people who legitimately believed that Federalists, guys like Hamilton, guys like John Adams, were out to just eliminate states altogether and have the United States be one polity without any state boundaries or state governments at all. I have never seen any evidence for any of that. That's not something that I've ever seen John Adams or John Jay or John Marshall, any of the Johns, or George Washington or anybody write about. But it was a thing, that a rumor that got circulated around that grew legs, gained traction. That's how these things work. So Westerners are not shy about making their displeasure known, and there are violent protests in 1791 and 1792 in every state south of New York. Obviously, they're pissed off about having to pay the tax on these goods, but it wasn't just that they were upset about. They were upset about the federal government intruding on their affairs from their point of view, and they were upset because whiskey had actually come to function as a kind of currency in the West. There wasn't a lot of gold and silver coins or bars, specie is what they would call it back then, to act as cash. And there wasn't a lot of paper money available way out west there because there were very few banks that existed. Banks in those days often printed their own money, and there was certainly no real universal federal system of currency the way that we have and have had for many, many, many years, basically since the Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913. We've had a standardized currency. That didn't exist, and there were some notes. Some of the notes that were used to provide proof of government debt could be used as currency, but there wasn't much of that out in the West either. So whiskey worked as a medium of exchange between people because everybody basically knew its value. a lot of people produced it, and it was something that was more or less universally useful to a lot of different types of people. Whiskey was more easily transportable than a lot of other options might be, and putting an excise tax on it meant that it was now becoming more difficult to use this very common medium of exchange. And the more of it that you produced, the more tax you would have to pay, and of course that cuts into your earnings or your savings or whatever it might be. So you have all these objections. From what I've read, George Washington couldn't even appoint officials who would be responsible for collecting this excise tax, and opposition was so strong in a place out west like Kentucky that nobody was willing to take the job. They were afraid they were going to be lynched or something. That's how violent and fervent the protests became over the excise tax. People were afraid to just go out and do their jobs and collect it in much the same way that stamp tax collectors were afraid to go out and do their jobs in the 1760s when that was a thing. And as you might imagine, there were people opposed to the excise tax that drew a comparison between the Stamp Act and the excise tax, saying that they were similar forms of tyranny over the people. I don't think that's really a great comparison, if we're being honest here, because this was the American government that had been elected by American voters putting the excise tax into place. It wasn't a distant British government that nobody had a voice in. So it's good propaganda, but I don't think it's a real apples to apples comparison. Anyway, as all this protest is going on, Hamilton is urging Washington and those around him more and more to do something, to take some really serious action to show that the government actually has some teeth, because that is one of the key differences between the Articles of Confederation government and the new federal government under the Constitution. One of the reasons that the federal government under the Constitution came into being was that the Articles government was so ineffectual and couldn't really do anything about stuff like Shays' Rebellion. So this was a chance and an important opportunity in the mind of a guy like Hamilton, who is very interested in national power and its importance to an orderly and structured society, and its importance in making the nation a coherent whole. This was an important opportunity to use federal power to make the law be the law, and not just a proclamation that's put out there that people can choose to obey or not, depending on what they feel about it. So Hamilton starts really pushing Washington and others in the government to do something. Hamilton said it was, quote, absolutely necessary that a decided experiment should without delay be made of the energy of the laws and of the government to put them in execution, unquote. So in other words, we need to demonstrate in the federal government that these laws mean something and that we have the ability to enforce them. Washington was a lot less eager to use force. He saw this as a real double-edged sword. Washington was a little more, maybe let's not send out the troops right away and have them enforce this at gunpoint. But Washington did issue a proclamation in September of 1792 to denounce anybody who was resisting the excise tax. So it's not anything really forceful, but it does say from the most trusted, most respected man in the country, hey, what you guys are doing, the way that you are opposing this, I don't appreciate it. It's not good for the country. The government ultimately didn't do anything about the excise tax or enforcing it in 1793, despite the continued violence and protest. So 1793 goes by, and there is no major enforcement of the excise taxes, despite all of this protest and despite all of this violence that has gone on in the western part of the country. In 1794, new excise taxes are proposed, but not passed, and uprisings begin again. This time, there's a very serious one against Pittsburgh, which is the only town of any size in the West in the mid-1790s. Something like 6,000 or 7,000 men marched to threaten residents and the federal arsenal there in 1794. After Washington sent a peace commission to Pittsburgh in August of 1794 and nothing was really resolved, he raised an army of 15,000 militiamen from the states of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. and he marched that army at least part of the way out there himself. When the protesters saw the army, they said, fuck this, we're out. And they bailed. The rebellion melted away, effectively, once it saw that there was going to be some kind of real enforcement of the excise tax. When all the dust settled, the army had arrested 20 leaders of the so-called Whiskey Rebellion. 2 of them were convicted of treason, but Washington pardoned both of them. An early use of the presidential pardon power is that Washington said, all right, no harm, no foul. Let's just try to move forward and forget all this. And that is really the point of the presidential pardon power when it was conceived of at the Constitutional Convention, is that they, the representatives at the Constitutional Convention, knew that there was going to be some instances of political opposition that would happen in the wake of the Constitution and other things. And they wanted to give the executive the opportunity to just give those who had perhaps legitimate political beefs and had done things in the spirit of those political disagreements that might have broken some laws, might have been conceived of as treason or sedition or something like that. They wanted to grant the executive the ability to give them a pass and to let bygones be bygones and not create some kind of long-standing political feud that would simmer and never go away. And this is exactly the kind of thing that Washington used the pardon power to do with the Whiskey Rebellion. You guys had a gripe, you had a problem, I understand it. Maybe you didn't handle it the best way, but I'm going to let you off and we're going to forget the whole thing. The Whiskey Rebellion is important for a couple of reasons. Number one, it demonstrated that the federal government could, as spelled out in the Constitution, handle crises like Shays' Rebellion, which the Articles of Confederation government absolutely could not handle, in a way that those who were nervous about the anarchy of democracy wanted to see. The Whiskey Rebellion and the federal government response to it demonstrated that this new national government was stronger, more decisive, could maintain order, could stop lawlessness in a way that the Articles of Confederation government, which was so much weaker, couldn't. And this is precisely the reason that a lot of the people who had drafted the Constitution, who had pushed for its ratification, this is why they wanted it, to handle situations like this, to make sure that the excesses of democracy, that roving bands of thieves, that pirates, that foreigners who sought to take advantage of the United States and its vast lands and its difficult to protect borders would not be able to do so and not have their threats answered by a strong national force that could protect all of the citizens from threats like those. So this was an important proving point and kind of an I told you so for the folks who wanted the Constitution ratified and a rebuke of the folks who didn't want the Constitution ratified. It was kind of an I told you so for the Federalists. As I alluded to a moment ago, the Whiskey Rebellion is also important, though, because it firms up some of the political parties that are already taking shape by the time 1794 rolls around. Because by that time, as I will discuss here momentarily, the political parties are already taking shape. Those who were upset about the excise tax, those who were upset about the federal government's response to protesters of the excise tax, they become a pretty important constituency of one of the emerging political parties, the Democratic-Republican Party. Because the Democratic-Republican Party has as one of its central tenets the idea that the federal government is potentially too big, potentially too powerful. We want to keep an eye on it. We want to have as much of a strict constructionist interpretation of the Constitution as possible to ensure that the federal government does not become this behemoth, this tyrannical thing that overwhelms the rights of individuals and the powers and abilities and rights of the states. So the Whiskey Rebellion both demonstrates the federal government's ability to maintain order and adds to the anxieties of those who are nervous already about the federal government and helps to create another group of folks who identify with the politics of the Democratic-Republican Party as it emerges. Speaking of the Democratic-Republican Party, or the Republican Party, which I'm just going to refer to it going forward as the Republican Party because it's easier to say and because that's what a lot of people referred to it as at the time. It is a little confusing because it is not the same thing, as I said already, as the current Republican Party or as the one that emerged. The current Republican Party emerged in the 1850s. This is not that Republican Party. But I'm just going to call it the Republican Party because that's how a lot of people referred to it. So there is this significant Republican interest that emerges as early as 1791. You see it start to organize itself in Congress, and there is an element of it coming from the executive branch. And what it organizes around is opposition to the Bank of the United States, opposition to increased power and authority in the federal government, fear of monarchy, which is something I'll explain a little bit more in a moment, and anxiety over a northern bias in the United States and in the federal government. There's this fear that the federal government is becoming too controlled by and reflective of the interests of those in the Northeast. And in particular, this is coming from Virginia, which at the time is the largest, wealthiest, most powerful of all of the states. And you'll recall, perhaps, that the fight in Virginia over ratification was one of the toughest fights. And that was in no small part because Virginia was very much the most powerful, most influential state. And a lot of Virginians knew what they would be giving up if they backed this much more powerful federal government. They would be losing their sort of very special place and their very influential place in the Union. A lot of these folks, being Southerners, saw what the federal government was doing and thought that it was acting, if not contrary to their interests, then at least not favorable to their interests. And when I say that there's a little bit of this, or there's some of this coming from the executive branch, I am referring to Thomas Jefferson, who was a member of the Washington administration and who actively opposed a lot of what the Washington administration was trying to do as he was a part of it. He was Secretary of State, and he stayed until I think it was New Year's Day, 1794, that Washington accepted his resignation. And all the while that he's there, Washington valued his input. He really wanted to have Jefferson stay around. There were times earlier than late 1793, early 1794 that Jefferson wanted to walk away because he didn't like the direction of the administration. He was really butting heads with Alexander Hamilton, and he just felt like he was not being heard and his ideas were not shaping the direction of the administration or of the government in general. But Washington pushed him hard to stay because Washington valued his input. Washington saw he was a smart guy and wanted somebody as a part of the administration who would disagree with him and disagree with the others there and present an alternative point of view. The most effective presidents in U.S. history have typically done that, have had a diversity of opinion in their cabinet. And that was something that Washington valued. I am not terribly fond of the way that Jefferson chose to do this. I think it was a little backhanded. Look, to be frank, the more I have researched a lot of the stuff, the more I've read about the creation of the Constitution, about the early federal government, about the Founding Fathers, the more I have started to become pretty disillusioned and annoyed with Thomas Jefferson. The most common charge is the whole hypocrisy over slavery thing, that he wrote the Declaration of Independence. He espoused these ideas of all men are created equal, and he wasn't even principled enough about it to let his slaves go when he died, which that's a very obvious, piece of hypocrisy that I think it's difficult to reconcile with all the things that he said that he believed in. But it's not just that. It's the fact that he was kind of a conniving little bitch during his time as a political actor in many capacities. As Secretary of State, what that looked like was disagreeing with a lot of the policies pursued by the Washington administration and saying so sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly. But then Jefferson mostly attacked the Washington administration through an intermediary, most notably Philip Freneau, who was a translator in the State Department. So he was on the government payroll. At the same time he was allegedly a translator for the State Department, he was also publishing this newspaper, the National Gazette, that was trashing everything the Washington administration was doing. You get that? So Jefferson was, on the one hand, acting as Secretary of State for the Washington administration and being very flattering and kind to Washington and saying he disagreed and so forth and clashing pretty openly with Hamilton. But at the same time, he was trashing almost everything the Washington administration did, calling Washington himself a monarchist and all of the people in the Washington administration monarchists. And Hamilton is somebody who wanted to destroy republicanism in general in the country, like a Republican form of government. That kind of thing doesn't sit well with me. I'm someone who believes that you go directly to people with your disagreements and you approach them civilly if you can, but it's better to get it out there and say what you need to say and not talk behind somebody's back. That I have a problem with. And that's just one of the things that Jefferson did that really bothers me the more that I read about the man. So Jefferson's stock has not risen in my book the more that I read about the man. I'll say that. Jefferson was leading the opposition to the Washington administration, to the Federalist program, while he was Secretary of State, and definitely kicked it up a couple of notches after he resigned in early 1794. By 1792, there were murmurs of a Republican Party that represented a radical Whig or country opposition against the, quote, corrupt Federalist aristocrats, or, quote, Federalist monarchists. And this is a term that Jefferson and Madison to some degree like to throw around a lot. Monocrats, people who were opposed in some fashion to a Republican form of government, at least in their view, and people who, in Jefferson's kind of paranoid fantasies, because he saw monarchists everywhere. They were all over the place, and they were this close to overthrowing the government and instituting a king. He, Jefferson, and some others around him saw these monocrats as seeking to usurp power from the states and from the people, and to put elites back in charge, and to establish an American aristocracy and an American monarchy ultimately. By the spring of 1792, Hamilton realized that Madison and Jefferson were allied. He'd not quite put together that Madison was against him too. He knew Jefferson was because they'd had plenty of arguments in cabinet meetings, but he wasn't positive that Madison was until the spring of 1792. Jefferson and Madison incorrectly suspected Hamilton of insider trading, that he was using his position in the Treasury to enrich himself the way that, for instance, a guy like William Dewar, who was a famous inside trader, he had a position in the Treasury Department, did William Dewar, and he used it to try to enrich himself. Unfortunately, all he did was create a speculative bubble that crashed, and he ended up going to prison. Jefferson and Madison tried to paint Hamilton with the same brush as Dewar. They tried to say that he was just like Dewar and that Hamilton was using his inside information to make himself wealthy and to bribe, effectively, members of the legislature of Congress with the information that he had so that they, the members of Congress, would put forward the policies that Hamilton wanted. There just wasn't any proof for what Jefferson and Madison were saying. Sure, Hamilton tried to influence members of Congress. Hamilton tried to persuade members of Congress that his course of action was the correct one, that it was best for the country. In the same way that Jefferson did while he was Secretary of State. He did the same kind of thing. Only in Jefferson's view, of course, I only talked to people when they asked me my opinion, and when I knew that they kind of agreed with me, which is just horseshit. Jefferson tried to advocate for his positions in much the same way Hamilton did, although probably not as openly and as aggressively. Jefferson always had to use back channels. Such a little bitch boy. In 1792, in the National Gazette, that was again published by Jefferson's homie, Furneaux, who was working in the State Department as a translator, remember, Madison writes this editorial, essentially, a candid state of parties, that was published on September 26th of 1792, and it referred to an ideological split rather than actual political parties, because that still, in 1792, wasn't quite a thing yet. But the groundwork had been laid for political parties. They just hadn't totally coalesced into actual political parties. There was already massive distrust and division that is hardening as the Republicans are convinced their opponents want an English monarchy. This became, as I said, kind of a paranoid fantasy of people like Thomas Jefferson, who saw monarchists all over the place, and who Washington, when Jefferson confronted him with this fear of monarchists, Washington said, look, man, are there some people that maybe want a monarchy here? Yeah, but they're not that many of them, and they're not that influential. Chill, my dude. Chill the fuck out, is essentially what Washington said. At the same time, what's going on in France, the revolution there, that hardens a lot of Federalists against direct democracy, against giving more power to the people, and they see their opponents, people who are pushing back against their program, against Hamilton's programs, against the Washington administration's direction and the Federalists in Congress, they see all of those people as radical anarchist democratic nut jobs, and that Jefferson is a guy who would rather have the kind of anarchy in France than have some kind of orderly government where the worst impulses of people could be constrained. That was the sort of caricature, I guess you would say, of both sides of each other. By 1793, consistent voting blocks resembling party affiliation had emerged, and Democratic-Republican societies began to appear as early as April of 1793. But they do dissipate when the French Revolution starts to really go off the rails at about the same time. It's when Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette are executed. It's not long after that that the Reign of Terror begins, and you get all these executions that are going on. Tens of thousands of people ultimately are executed. And the combination of the excesses of the French Revolution, the violence of the French Revolution, and Washington's criticism of the Democratic Republican societies, and Washington's criticism of the French Revolution, on top of the Whiskey Rebellion and the way that Washington had to step in and put that down and criticize the people who'd taken part in the violence and the protests. All of that stuff compiled together made it so that these Democratic Republican societies and open support for the French Revolution faded away, because it was a bad look for people to embrace something like the French Revolution, which had gone so much further than many people could stomach in the United States. So the key constituencies of the Republican Party at this point are the Southern aristocrats, the big plantation owners, who were opposed to federal authority and saw the federal government as being too favorable to and focused on merchants and bankers and stuff like that in the Northeast. That's one constituency. Then there's also the skilled laborers and artisans all over the country who see the government, the federal government, as too sympathetic to and too focused on the wealthy bankers and merchants of the Northeast. So, though the artisans and middle-class folks don't have a lot in common with the wealthy planter aristocracy of the South, they both share a kind of suspicion about how much the federal government is doing for these wealthy Northeasterners. And then there's also, of course, the folks on the frontier and in rural areas who are nervous about the federal government. They resent all the authority that the federal government has taken on. They resent the fact that the federal government did not protect them from Native Americans and is this distant force that they don't have a lot of connection to and is telling them what to do with things like the excise tax. Those groups are the original foundation of the Democratic Republican or the Republican Party. It's the wealthy planter aristocrats, it's the artisans and laborers and some small manufacturers of various parts of the country, mostly New York and north of there, though. Pennsylvania a little bit too, I guess. And those on the frontier in rural areas who oppose the federal government because they see it as a threat to their freedom, their liberty, and as something distant and not really connected to themselves, just this big bully, potential tyrant. Okay, last thing I'll get into here is the French Revolution and its effects on all of this stuff, the creation of political parties. And I think the simplest way to think of the French Revolution and what it had to do with what was going on in the United States is that it just sharpened and hardened the differences between the parties that already existed. So it kind of exacerbated, it made these divisions a lot more dramatic there was a lot more conflict because of the French Revolution and the things that happened that were directly connected to it in the United States. So there are already these divisions between the two parties in terms of constitutional interpretation, power of the federal government, economic policy, that sort of thing. The French Revolution initially was embraced by both Federalists and Republicans, but it became a divisive issue after Louis XVI was executed. Because at that point, Federalists really turned against it hard. They were like, okay, this has gone totally fucking sideways, and we can't get behind this. Whereas a lot of Republicans saw, okay, yeah, that's not good. We don't endorse chopping off the head of the king, but this movement's really important, and it needs to be continued and seen through to its end. Otherwise, not only is democracy over in Europe and France threatened, it's threatened here too. That's the way, especially a guy like Jefferson, saw it. Again, another thing that kind of annoys me about Jefferson a little bit, he made up every excuse in the book for everything that happened in France. It was all okay because it was going in the right direction. And he never really kind of acknowledged just how bad things got. The conflict, the French Revolution, because it was very shortly after Louis was executed that Britain and France went to war. So that conflict between Britain and France hurt Hamilton's program, his economic program. And French revolutionaries were very sympathetic figures to Jefferson, as I mentioned. So the two leaders of the emerging parties were on totally opposite sides of the conflict, which helped to sharpen those divisions. Both sides considerably exaggerated the French Revolution's impact for propaganda, political purposes. Many Federalists came to blame the French Revolution for all of the United States' democratic troubles or excesses of democracy, which really isn't very honest. And Jefferson and a lot of Republicans pinned democracy's survival, as I said a moment ago, on what happened with the French Revolution, which was overstating it. If the French Revolution went a different way, it's hard to imagine that all of a sudden the republic, democracy in America, would collapse. Both Hamilton and Jefferson, however, urged Washington to remain neutral in the conflict between Britain and France. Washington, issued the Neutrality Proclamation in April 22nd of 1793, although the word neutrality is not mentioned specifically in that proclamation, but it's pretty clear from the way that it's written and what it says that the United States is not going to intervene on France's behalf, despite the fact that we had signed a treaty of amity and friendship with France during the Revolution. Remember, they helped us to defeat Great Britain. Without them, it's hard to imagine the Revolution having succeeded. Jefferson, in one of his classic about faces, where he says one thing and then changes his mind all of a sudden very dramatically, backed away from his endorsement of neutrality, while Madison, who was a little iffy about it right from the jump, felt that the Neutrality Proclamation undermined both U.S. credibility, because we had made this commitment to France during the Revolution, and U.S. honor, because it wasn't a good look. Furthermore, Madison felt that Washington's decision to issue this Neutrality Proclamation stepped on what should have been a congressional prerogative. Madison, remember, the father of the Constitution, the guy most responsible for what it looks like now, he saw this area of governance as something the legislative branch should have at least a shared role with the executive branch in determining. But Washington saw, and so did others in his administration, foreign affairs, the State Department as an executive thing, and this was a decision that he could make and that future presidents could make on their own. So he did it. The division between the parties was further heightened when it came to the French Revolution because of the actions of the French minister, Edmond Charles Genet. Genet advocated for arming French privateers in American ports, and I think you can see how that would further entangle the United States in the conflict between Britain and France in a way that the Neutrality Proclamation was very much designed to avoid. And he did that, did Genet, without any kind of approval from the Washington administration or from Congress. He also, did Genet, encouraged Americans to fight with the French against the British, against the Spanish, in positions in North America. So not only is he trying to use American ports to arm French private sailors who are going to go fight with the French Navy, presumably, he is also trying to get American citizens to go off and fight Britain and France. So he's working very much at cross purposes with what Congress wants, with what the Washington administration wants, and it's not something that foreign ministers are supposed to do. Genet is eventually dismissed and seen as a big mistake by those in charge in France, but then the British begin seizing American ships because the British are trying to prevent Americans from supplying the French with anything that might be useful in war. This whole situation, the British seizing American ships, prompts the Washington administration to send John Jay to Great Britain to negotiate some kind of settlement of these issues in 1795. And Jay comes up with this treaty, the details of which are leaked to the American public in a way that further inflames political tensions because the terms of the treaty are seen as very pro-Britain in a way that exercises all of the Republican constituencies. Even in the wake of these protests, the Senate approves and Washington eventually signs the Jay Treaty, as it comes to be called, in August of 1795. Here's what it did. It tried to resolve a lot of long-standing issues. You might recall that in previous episodes I'd mentioned that the British having these forts on the frontier in the Old Northwest, that was a problem. That the British supplying weapons and other kinds of things to Native Americans, attacking frontier positions, that was a problem. Obviously, the seizing of ships is a problem. The inability of Americans to trade with even British colonies is a problem. So what this did, what the Jay Treaty said, was that the British would agree to evacuate, finally, completely, their forts on the frontier in the Old Northwest. The British would allow Americans to trade with British colonies, although there would be some limitations to that, like on the size of the ships that could go there, for instance. There would be shared navigation of the Mississippi River. The Americans would be compensated for the ships that had been seized, and there would be a greater effort to repay debts that existed before and during the Revolutionary War, and in a way that would presumably make some of the Loyalists whole, which had been another big bone of contention between the independent United States and Britain. The Loyalists, the British subjects who remained loyal to Britain during the Revolution, lost a lot during the Revolution and were never really compensated. So this was at least a step in that direction in a way. Kind of indirectly, but it was meant to help them out as well. So the Jay Treaty accomplished those things. Washington signed it. Jay was burned in effigy for it. It was seen as a capitulation to the British by those more sympathetic to the French. And Washington at this point is just sick to death of being president. He really wanted to walk away after his first term. He was pushed by Jefferson, among other people, to stay because everyone recognized his importance as a unifying figure for the entire country. And a lot of folks were afraid of what would happen with the presidency after Washington retired. So he did stay for a second term, though he didn't really want to. He walked away once his second term was over and established through that action the precedent of the two-term tradition, which was not in the Constitution. If you know a little bit about your history, you know that FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, was elected 4 terms. It wasn't until after Roosevelt's presidency that the Constitution was amended to say that a president can only be elected for 2 terms, 2 full terms. On his way out, Washington delivered, I'm putting that in air quotes because he didn't actually give the speech to anybody. He just had it printed in newspapers, essentially. His farewell address, it was originally composed by James Madison. By this time, James Madison and Washington, their relationship had very much soured in much the same way that Washington's relationship with Thomas Jefferson had soured. So Hamilton worked on the speech that Madison originally wrote, and that is what Washington gave to newspapers to print out. It cautioned, did Washington's farewell address, against what he called entangling alliances, those that would commit the United States in a way that would force action or inaction on part of the United States. And that became a really important principle for the United States right up until World War I, was the United States did not get into serious long-term alliances with other countries, in no small part because Washington had urged the country not to. Washington warned about the divisiveness of political factions, and you can read that as political parties. I mean, he didn't say it that way, but that's pretty clearly what he was talking about. And he called, as he always did, as he tried to become an example of during his time as president, for national unity. That was a big focus of his presidency. He threw out one last shout out for it. He was really unhappy with Thomas Jefferson and James Madison at the end of his presidency. He looked at what they had done as a betrayal. He learned more and more about it at the end of his presidency and after he walked away. He never saw them again. He refused to. He refused to communicate with them ever again. And there's a story about after he died, after Washington died, Jefferson paid a visit to Mount Vernon 2 years later. Martha Washington, who was still there and who received Jefferson, called it the second worst day of her life after Washington's death. That was the degree to which Washington had felt betrayed. Again, it's another reason why I'm not super fond of Thomas Jefferson after having done all this. To be clear, I don't think Jefferson was an awful human being. I don't think that he doesn't deserve his place in history. He did a lot of really important stuff. But the more I learn about him, the more I'm just not real fond of the guy. And I think I'm going to do an episode here pretty soon where I talk about the whole Jefferson-Hamilton dynamic. I'm going to focus on that a little more and explain why I'm very much Team Hamilton and not Team Jefferson in a little more detail. So this one went a little long. Thanks for sticking with me. I hope you found this to be useful and entertaining, as you always do, of course. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. If you want to get in touch with me, you can do so at howthehelldiwegetherepod@gmail.com, or you can send me a voicemail or text message at area code 951-525-5536. Thanks again. Really appreciate your time and attention as always. Take care, and I will see y'all next time.